Rick Grenell, our Senior Advisor for Foreign Policy and National Security, is joining us. We're going to talk politics in a minute with Rick, but we want to talk about these overseas, which means here in our country, Chinese police stations being utilized to track Chinese nationals in the United States and in other countries. There's any reports of 50 to 100 of these around the world.
Yep.
We know they're operating here in the United States. There's one in Chinatown in New York City. And they try to describe, this is a place like if you run into trouble in the United States, you need help with a visa. But there's already consulates and consular services available, plenty of those by the Chinese.
Every major city.
In every major city. And then, of course, in Washington, they have their embassy. But there's also the connection of course, the pressure that can be put on these nationals to take actions adverse to the United States.
Yep.
Because they've got family at home in China.
And they're
again,
grabbing the kids. What they said.
You can utilize this whole new group of people who are here for no nefarious reason.
Yep.
And put pressure on them to spy, put pressure on them to, again, take advantage of the unique situations they may find themselves in.
So 230,000 Chinese that were in the United States have been sent back in the last 15 months, Rick, by the Chinese government. The idea, and you were the acting director of national intelligence, that the Chinese have a quote, police station offering information or whatever they're doing, which is going to be nefarious, we know that, in the United States, particularly in New York, is really troubling. I mean, and in other countries where they're doing it, the reaction of their intelligence officials, in like your counterparts, have been very strong. They're saying that, for instance, in the Netherlands, they've opened up an investigation on this, and they call them, we're investigating the activities of, this is in the Netherlands, of these so-called police centers that have opened up. How serious could this be?
Look, I think I've said it a million times here. Russia's a problem, but China is a crisis. And no one should be surprised in the United States that the Communist Party of China has enforcement mechanisms that they utilize and leverage, not only in the United States through these enforcement groups, maybe you call them police stations, but it's also happening on our universities. And it's happening through the funding that Chinese businessmen who are connected to the Chinese Communist Party are doing in our universities, and then creating technology. Look, they're funding this research, creating technology, and then demanding that these people come back to China. They're literally taking advantage of our open system. We should demand that our politicians do something. They cannot just sit by. The Trump administration began to really focus on this, and then COVID hit. And we really were in a predicament because of all of the pressure that the Chinese government was going to put on us. But our politicians, Washington, D.C., the Biden administration needs to get very focused on this.
I'm going to follow that up, Rick, if I can, and that is, when you mentioned the COVID situation, so that kind of derailed a lot of things. I mean, if you look at what the impact of that has been, and I'm hopeful that once the Republicans are back in power, we're going to find out where this originated and what entity or government entity is responsible. But you mentioned the college campuses, and this is a gigantic problem. Chinese resource centers, they're calling them, or cultural centers is what they call them on the college campuses. There is so much money coming from these countries, from that country, to the United States educational institution, including our Ivy League schools, or maybe especially our Ivy League schools, that it's changing the way in which these schools then will teach and address what is, as you said, the greatest threat potential to the United States, which is China.
I got to be very careful as the former DNI on how I talk about this next subject, but let me just generically give you an example of what they do, Jay. The Chinese community of communists all throughout China are utilizing every leverage possible. They did this through PPE. They got to our local politicians to say, you can get PPE if you talk positively about us. If you talk negatively about us, we're going to cut you off. But we also know that the universities will go to engineering students, American engineering students, and they'll say, hey, you're a smart person. Can you teach a course for an hour and we'll pay you $1,000? And our university engineers are taking these little gigs. That little gig then turns into, hey, can you do a 4-hour seminar? That turns into, can you come to Beijing for a weekend? The price goes from $1,000 to $5,000 to we'll pay you $25,000 if you come here. Suddenly now our engineering students are giving away our intellect, our intellectual policies, and they're giving it to the communist government, and the communist government is leveraging them, saying, you've now given us state secrets, you got to give us more.
Yeah, this is a real attack.
It is an attack. That's the perfect word to use. It's an attack on our democracy and our transparency and our willingness to be capitalists.
Yeah, and I think it's that multi-level approach that we have to be so concerned about, is that it starts off with these small, these police stations that, it's about our own citizens, not about Americans, don't worry about that. And yet this is you can turn an entire group of people who didn't come for nefarious reasons, even to the United States, into spies by putting the pressure on them to say, you know what? We know where you are. We know where your family is. If you don't give us this information from the university or whatever you're studying or wherever you work, your family's going to be in trouble. So we know this is a real problem. It's internationally a problem. I think that's good news that the rest of the world is starting to also pay attention to this. I do want to get to, Rick, some politics as well. We are looking at, of course, again, things feel like they're trending in the Republican way, which is always great when you're about a week out from Election Day, as we are. But I know you're out on the trail, and out west, too, in places like Arizona, where, again, it feels good. But if you look at the polls, and again, you don't
really
too
close.
much weight in polls, but none of them are showing any kind of blowouts. So it is still, as we're, if you got these 7 days to work, turnout, talking to friends and family, getting people actually to vote is a huge deal right now, because, again, you can kind of almost toss the polls out. We know these races are very close, which means turnout will determine who wins.
Yeah, it's really a good point. I know we're close because the New York Times just wrote a story that said in all 4 of the key Senate races, Republicans are slightly behind, which means to tell you we're way ahead. And so what we really have to be able to do right now is concentrate on, as you say, Jordan, get out the vote. People need to vote. You need to realize that this is a red wave, but it only can be a red wave tsunami if you get out and vote and drag 10 people to the polls. I've been all over Arizona and Nevada. I'm going again this week. I'll be there starting on Tuesday. And I have to say that it feels really good on the ground. It feels like it's going to be a big win for Adam Laxalt, for Blake Masters, for Kari Lake, for Abe Hamadeh. But we have to continue pushing all the way to the finish line. Remember, Republicans vote on Election Day. Democrats are voting early. And so when you see some of the very early numbers that drop right when the polls close, that's counting the Democrats. And so we're probably going to be behind as Republicans in the very beginning, but that's because they haven't quite counted the votes on Election Day.
Rick, you mentioned Abe Hamadeh, who's a friend of ours, and of course he's running for the Arizona Attorney General slot. And I keep reminding people, the governor, important. Senators, important. Congressman, important. But let me tell you something. The state attorney general and the school board are probably the 2 most impactful to the individual citizens of a state. And I just wanted, I'm glad you mentioned Abe, who I think will be a great attorney general, without a doubt. He's a really smart guy and very good lawyer. But people overlook those races. And the other thing I don't want people to do, Rick, is this idea, there's all this voter irregularity, my vote doesn't count. I've been harping on that. We've got to get people out to vote, period.
Yeah, for sure. That's incredibly important. We've made some fixes. We still got work to do, but the system should be a little bit better. But you've got to get out and overpower the polls and make sure that every single person votes. I just want to add one thing, because I do know on the West, I've been concentrating on the West. Sigal Chadha is running for Attorney General in Nevada. Your point about getting really good AGs. This is an Israeli-American. She's amazing. And George Soros is going after both Abe Hamadeh in Arizona, and he's going after Sigal Chadha in Nevada. That's because these 2 young people are going to absolutely make a difference. He doesn't want to see.
You should try to get both of those, Will, on the air. I mean,
And
Abe contacted me
it's
this
such
week.
a good reminder, because if you watch where the Soros money goes, They figured that out. What you just said, they've long figured out. The DAs,
right down to the district attorney.
Yeah, the AG's races. They realize, it's good. Those big races, everybody cares about the Senate, the flashy, the gubernatorial race. But the AGs, the DAs, the school boards, they're putting national money into those.
And by the way, back on the Chinese situation really quick, Rick, they're trying to impact school boards too. We know that. Even in the local high schools and elementary schools.
For sure. We got to keep concentrating on it. That's why we shut down the consulate in Houston under the Trump administration.
Exactly. You understand that. The consulate in Houston was shut down because of activities just like this. Rick, thanks as always.